if ego isn't the enemy? I assume that's a question that most people would never think to ask. But those of us who have or are studying Buddhism might have heard phrases like, you need to crush or abandon your ego. The Buddha said that the root of suffering is ignorance of our true self, and that's often translated as the ego being the root of suffering. But the more I sit with this and the more my understanding of Jungian psychology grows, the more I wonder if Buddhists are misunderstanding what the ego really is. And is the word ego even right for what the Buddha meant? For many of us, the word ego carries a lot of baggage, even without the Buddhist viewpoint. We think of it as arrogance, self-importance, or that inflated sense of self that makes someone unbearable to be around. And in spiritual teachings, often the ego is seen as something to be eradicated, a false construct that keeps us trapped in illusion. In Buddhism, the word ego is described as meaning a false sense of self, something that doesn't exist in the singular, independent, and permanent way that we tend to think it does. And the cause of suffering is clinging to this false self. We act to protect it and provide for its desires, and in so doing, we create suffering for ourselves and for others. Hence, to avoid suffering, we need to know who we really are and act from that, not from this false idea of who we are. I find that all quite logical, but I do question the use of the word ego to describe this false sense of self, because it seems to me that that word brings in a lot of confusion and it can lead to what I'd call ego bashing, where the goal seems to be to strip away any sense of self entirely. But here's the thing, without a sense of self, how do we navigate the world? How do we set boundaries, make decisions, or protect ourselves from harm? What if the problem isn't the ego itself, but our misunderstanding of it? In Jungian psychology, where the modern understanding of the word ego comes from, the ego is the part of the mind that mediates between our conscious and our unconscious selves. It's responsible for reality testing, and it gives us a basic sense of self, a sense that we exist. In this sense, the ego isn't some villain to be vanquished, it's a vital tool. It helps us make ethical decisions, set boundaries, and engage with the world in a healthy way. Jungian psychology also recognizes the false sense of self, but this is not the ego, it's the persona. Our persona is not ourselves, it's essentially a social mask, and we can have more than one adapted for different circumstances. And even personas are seen as necessary sometimes. For instance, we probably have a work persona, and so long as we know it's a construct for a specific purpose and not us in our entirety, it's no problem. In the Jungian view of self, a psychologically healthy person not only doesn't mistake the persona for the self, they also don't mistake the ego for the self. It's only a function of it, just one part, and it plays a necessary role in our lives. There is no good reason in this view for thinking that one should abandon or destroy the ego. There's simply a need to recognize it for what it is and not mistake it for our whole self. But isn't this very close to the actual teaching on ego in Buddhism? Not that the ego should be destroyed, but that we need to realize its true nature. What we destroy isn't the ego itself, but our attachment to it as a solid, independent, permanent thing. At least that's as I understand it. It may not exist on the ultimate or quantum level of reality, but it does exist in a functional sense. It's what allows us to operate in the world. I've seen what happens when the teachings on abandoning our attachment to ego are subtly misunderstood to mean abandoning the ego itself. This can be taken to such an extreme that we lose our sense of self entirely. In our effort to follow the instructions of a teacher we trust, we stop setting boundaries, stop protecting ourselves, and sometimes even hand over our autonomy to a teacher. This creates a really dangerous dynamic because without a healthy sense of self, we become vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. And for those in positions of power, it's all too easy to exploit students they've taught to suppress their ego at all costs. Fostering that kind of belief is actually one of the hallmarks of a destructive cult. But I'm pretty sure this isn't what the teachings are meant to do. As I understand it, they're not about destroying the ego or erasing the self. They're about understanding the true nature of self and reality. Once you've realized the true nature of ego, you no longer have any attachment to it. In fact, the whole idea of crushing the ego surely indicates a misunderstanding of its true nature, because the idea of crushing something depends on thinking that there's something to crush. You can't crush something that isn't solid to start with. In fact, by looking for something to crush, you may be solidifying it. Anyway, you might wonder why on earth this matters. It's because it's about balance. It's about holding two truths at once. The fact that the ego doesn't exist in the way we think it does, and that it's still necessary for living in the world. When we understand this, we don't feel the need to inflate our sense of self or protect it at all costs. At least that's the logic. We can let go of the fear that drives much of our ego-driven behaviour. At the same time, we can maintain a healthy sense of self that allows us to set boundaries, make those all-important ethical decisions, and engage with the world in a meaningful way. So maybe the question isn't how do I get rid of my ego, but rather what is the true nature of my ego? What would it look like to hold our sense of self lightly, to see it as both real and not real, necessary but not solid? I don't have the answers, but I think it's worth exploring. After all, we're not here to destroy ourselves, we're here to understand, to realise, and maybe even to embrace the paradox of being human. What do you think? I'd love to hear your comments. Just, do the usual. Chat away. Thanks for watching.